Before sunrise. In Ukraine, the land often looks quiet. The sky carries a pale shade of blue that slowly spreads across fields, villages, and tree lines. In many places across the country, that moment of early morning has become the hour when soldiers prepare for another day along the front. It was still dark when the Ukrainian unit arrived at the edge of the orchard. Rows of fruit trees stretched across the low ground beyond a narrow dirt path. In spring, those trees would normally carry blossoms. In autumn, they would hold fruit ready for harvest. But now the branches were mostly bare. The orchard had become something else entirely, a corridor, a path through open ground where movement had to be careful and quiet. Just beyond the far edge of the trees stood a defensive position held by Ukrainian soldiers who had spent the night watching the eastern horizon. Their trench line had been dug along the slight rise of land that overlooked a road further in the distance. That road had become an important route during the fighting in this region of Ukraine. If vehicles approached along that road, the soldiers in the trench would be the first to see them. But during the night, something else had happened. The soldiers holding the position had sent a short radio message back toward the orchard. Their supplies were running low. The message was brief. Ammunition needed before morning. The request traveled quickly through the network of Ukrainian units positioned across the area. A response came soon after. Someone would bring the supplies forward, but the route was not simple. Between the supply vehicle waiting further back and the trench line ahead stood the orchard and several hundred meters of open terrain beyond the final row of trees. The path was not impossible, but it carried risk. Movement across exposed ground at dawn always carries risk. That morning, one Ukrainian soldier stepped forward to take the task. She was part of the unit stationed near the supply point just behind the orchard. Her uniform carried the dust and marks of days spent moving between positions. She listened as the officer explained the route. The orchard would provide cover for most of the distance, but the final stretch would require crossing a short open area before reaching the trench. Timing would matter. The soldier nodded once. Then she lifted the first ammunition crate. The wooden box was heavy. Inside it rested the supplies the soldiers ahead needed to continue holding their position. 2 more crates waited beside the vehicle, but the first would have to reach the trench before anything else could follow. The Ukrainian soldier adjusted the straps of her gear and stepped toward the first row of trees. The orchard stood silent. Branches moved gently in the early morning wind. The ground beneath the trees carried the smell of damp soil and fallen leaves. From a distance, the orchard might have looked peaceful, but every soldier in the area understood what it had become. A narrow corridor between 2 positions during a war that had already changed so many ordinary places across Ukraine. The soldier moved carefully between the trees. Each step was placed slowly to avoid noise. The crate remained balanced in her arms. Behind her, the supply vehicle remained hidden along the dirt path where the rest of the unit waited quietly. Ahead, somewhere beyond the final row of trees, the Ukrainian trench line remained alert. The soldiers there had spent the entire night watching the horizon. Some of them stood behind sandbags with rifles resting across the edge of the trench. Others scanned the fields through binoculars, searching for any movement that might appear along the distant road. Their position had held through the night, but ammunition had grown limited. That was why the crate moving through the orchard mattered. Back among the trees, the Ukrainian soldier continued forward. The orchard rows formed long, narrow lanes stretching toward the far edge of the field. The soldier paused briefly behind one of the trees and listened. Wind moved softly through the branches. No engines, no distant movement, only the quiet sound of leaves shifting above the ground. She continued. Row after row passed behind her as the faint light of morning slowly grew stronger above the orchard. At one point, she stopped again near the center of the field. The crate remained steady in her arms. For a moment, she looked toward the faint outline of the trench line in the distance. Then she spoke softly. The words carried no announcement, just a quiet sentence spoken into the morning air. They're waiting. The final rows of trees stood only a short distance ahead. Beyond them waited the open ground that led directly to the Ukrainian defensive position. The soldiers there still watched the horizon, still listening, still holding the line across that small stretch of Ukraine. And moving carefully through the orchard toward them was a Ukrainian woman soldier carrying the ammunition they needed before sunrise. The light over the orchard grew slowly stronger. Dawn was approaching, though the sun had not yet risen above the horizon. The sky carried that dim blue tone that arrives just before the first sunlight touches the land. For soldiers moving near a front line, that hour can feel strangely suspended between night and day. The Ukrainian woman soldier stood briefly behind one of the final rows of trees. The wooden ammunition crate rested firmly in her arms. The weight had grown heavier with each step across the orchard, but she held it steady against her chest. Ahead, the final line of trees marked the edge of cover. Beyond them waited open ground. The distance was not long, but it was visible. That was the difference. Inside the orchard, the trees created narrow corridors where movement could remain hidden. Outside the orchard, the ground opened into a small clearing that led directly toward the trench where the Ukrainian defenders waited. The soldier stepped closer to the final row. The branches above her moved gently as a cool wind passed through the orchard. She paused again and listened. Silence carried across the fields. No engines, no distant movement along the road the trench overlooked. Only the quiet stillness of a morning that had not yet fully begun. In the trench ahead, the Ukrainian soldiers remained at their posts. They had received the message earlier that ammunition was on the way, but they did not know exactly when it would arrive. Along the edge of the trench, one soldier kept his binoculars raised toward the orchard. The rows of trees created shadows across the ground that made it difficult to see clearly between them. Still, he watched, because somewhere inside those rows, someone was bringing the supplies the trench needed. Back among the trees, the Ukrainian woman soldier shifted her grip on the crate. The wooden edges pressed firmly against her gloves. She adjusted her stance and took a slow breath. Then she stepped out from the final row of trees. The open ground stretched ahead of her. The trench stood visible now, a line of sandbags rising slightly above the earth, rifles positioned along the edge, figures moving behind the defensive wall. The soldier began walking toward them. Her pace remained steady, not rushed, but direct. Each step crossed ground that carried no cover. The early light of dawn spread across the field as she moved. Behind her, the orchard rows faded into shadow. Ahead, the trench grew clearer with every step. Inside the defensive position, one of the soldiers lowered his binoculars suddenly. He had seen movement, a single figure crossing the clearing from the orchard. At first, the shape was only a silhouette against the growing light. Then the details became clearer. A Ukrainian uniform, a soldier carrying a crate. The man beside him leaned forward over the sandbags to confirm what he was seeing. A quiet voice passed along the trench. "Supplies!" The word traveled quickly through the defensive line. Several soldiers moved closer to the edge of the trench, their eyes fixed on the approaching figure crossing the open ground. The Ukrainian woman soldier continued walking. The crate remained steady in her arms. The ground beneath her boots was uneven, marked by shallow tire tracks and patches of loose soil left from earlier movement in the area. She stepped carefully to keep the crate balanced. Halfway across the clearing, the wind carried the distant sound of something far beyond the fields. The soldier paused briefly. Her head turned slightly as she listened. The sound faded again. Silence returned. She resumed walking. Inside the trench, two soldiers climbed partially out of the defensive line and stepped forward. They moved carefully along the edge of the position to meet her before she reached the sandbags. When the soldier reached them, the first man extended his hands toward the crate. She passed it forward without a word. The soldier inside the trench immediately turned and carried the ammunition toward the center of the defensive position where the rest of the unit waited. For a moment, the woman remained standing near the trench edge. The journey across the orchard and the open ground had taken only minutes, but the soldiers inside the trench understood what it meant. Without those supplies, their position would soon have faced difficulty holding the line they had protected through the night. One of the soldiers beside her looked back toward the orchard. The early light of dawn now revealed the rows of trees stretching quietly across the field. Then he looked back toward her. His voice carried quiet respect. "You came through the orchard alone." The woman adjusted the strap of her gear and nodded slightly. Then she answered with a simple sentence. "They needed it." Inside the trench, the ammunition crate had already been opened. Belts and magazines were distributed quickly among the soldiers who returned to their watch positions along the defensive line. The routine resumed. Rifles rested along the sandbags. Binoculars returned to scanning the distant road. And the defensive line once again carried the supplies it needed to continue guarding that small stretch of Ukraine. The Ukrainian woman soldier stepped down into the trench. Behind her, the orchard stood quiet under the growing light of morning. Ahead of her, the soldiers returned to their posts. And the line they protected remained secure for another day. The sun finally began to rise above the fields. What had been a dim landscape only moments earlier slowly transformed as light spread across the orchard and the farmland beyond it. Long shadows from the rows of trees stretched across the ground where the Ukrainian soldier had walked just minutes before. Inside the trench, the soldiers noticed the change immediately. Morning light always reveals more of the land. The distant road became clearer. The open ground between the trench and the orchard stood fully visible now, showing every uneven patch of soil and every tire mark left by earlier movement. From the defensive line, one soldier leaned slightly against the sandbags and looked back toward the trees. The orchard stood quiet. Branches moved gently in the wind, carrying the soft, rustling sound of leaves brushing against one another. If someone had not known what had happened earlier that morning, the field might have appeared completely ordinary. But the soldiers in the trench knew differently. Only minutes earlier, one of their own had crossed that ground, carrying the supplies that allowed them to remain ready. The Ukrainian woman soldier who had walked through the orchard now stood inside the trench beside the others. The wooden crate she had delivered had already been opened. Inside, the ammunition had been distributed carefully among the defenders. Boxes were placed beside rifles. Belts were loaded into the machine gun positioned near the center of the trench. Magazines were checked and stacked along the inner wall of the defensive line where they could be reached quickly if needed. The entire process took only a few minutes, but it restored something essential to the position: confidence. When soldiers know their supplies are secure, their attention can remain focused entirely on the horizon ahead. The woman soldier watched quietly as the final items from the crate were placed into position. One of the men near the machine gun finished securing the belt into the weapon and then looked toward her, his voice carried across the trench with a calm tone. "We'll hold." She nodded once. The sentence did not need anything more. Holding the line was the entire purpose of the position. The trench itself had been dug along a slight rise overlooking the road that cut across the distant farmland. From where the soldiers stood, they could see the narrow strip of road weaving between fields and low patches of grass. Any vehicle moving along that route would become visible from the trench long before it reached the orchard. That visibility gave the defenders time, and time often makes the difference between holding ground and losing it. One soldier lifted his binoculars again and began scanning the road. Another adjusted the sandbags that reinforced the outer edge of the trench. The routine resumed almost immediately. War creates moments of intense action followed by stretches of watchful waiting. This morning was no different. The Ukrainian woman soldier stepped toward the edge of the trench and looked out across the orchard. Now that the sun had risen, the path she had taken earlier became easier to see. Rows of trees stretched in straight lines across the field. The clearing between the orchard and the trench stood open and exposed under the growing light. She studied the route quietly. The wooden crate she had carried earlier now rested empty against the trench wall behind her. Another soldier approached and stood beside her. For a moment, they both looked out across the orchard without speaking. Then the soldier said something quietly. "Long walk before sunrise." She allowed herself a small smile. Then she answered simply, "Not so long." The wind shifted across the field again. Somewhere beyond the distant road, a faint sound echoed briefly across the landscape. The soldiers in the trench noticed it immediately. The man with the binoculars raised them higher. The machine gunner adjusted his position slightly behind the sandbags. Everyone in the trench understood the same reality. The quiet could change quickly, but this time the sound faded away again. The horizon returned to stillness. The orchard remained silent, and the road beyond the fields showed no movement. The soldiers resumed their watch. Several minutes passed, then another Ukrainian soldier inside the trench closed the lid of the now empty crate and leaned it against the inner wall. He looked toward the woman who had carried it through the orchard. His voice carried quiet appreciation. "Good timing." She looked back toward the road once more before answering. "They needed it before daylight." The statement held no drama, just a simple explanation of what had been done. Across Ukraine, moments like that have taken place countless times along the front. Small actions, short journeys, quiet decisions made before sunrise that help a position remain ready when the day begins. Back in the trench, the soldiers continued scanning the horizon. The machine gun rested firmly behind the sandbags. Rifles remained positioned along the defensive line. The orchard behind them stood calm under the sunlight, but the trench itself had changed. It now held the supplies needed to continue protecting that stretch of land. The Ukrainian woman soldier adjusted the straps of her gear once more. She looked out across the orchard one last time. Then she spoke quietly, almost as if the words belonged to the morning itself. "The line holds." The wind carried the sound across the trench. No one answered. No one needed to. The soldiers already knew. They had watched the orchard. They had received the supplies, and the defensive line they guarded remained ready beneath the rising sun over Ukraine.